Welcome to Grief Sucks Life After Loss, where we talk all things grief. Thanks for being with us today, and we hope you enjoy this episode. Belia, thanks for being here with us today.
Hi, Linda. I am so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, you are coming to us kind of on a different perspective of real estate and insurance topics that can be very helpful in the situations of losses. So, yeah, I'll let you have it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that because it's a topic that a lot of people don't want to talk about. And I kind of refer to it as the business of death because people, it's hard to embrace death and have a conversation about the loss. And I do know, though, you don't want to be figuring all this out when you're in the middle of it.
You
And
don't? I did. It's not fun.
no, I don't wish that on anybody. And especially, so my background is in real estate. I am a licensed realtor in the state of New Mexico, but I now live in Indiana. And I've kind of shifted to consulting online. I do a lot of real estate investing and helping others learn how to invest in real estate. So part of that is also the insurance game. Not only, people think of liability insurance for, a bad tenant situation, but a lot of it's how do you protect your assets and how do you work so hard as an individual, as a family, especially as a woman. I was previously married and went through a divorce. And so part of that was protecting the rentals that I had built up.
Mhm.
Um, keeping my ex-husband out of them, and especially keeping him out 20 years down the road. I don't want to try to sell a property down the road and then all of a sudden I have to have him sign off on something because we were once upon a time married. So there's a lot of different pieces to protecting your assets, and especially in death. And I know we were kind of talking beforehand about especially your primary residence, and something happens to the other income earner, whether it's him or her, or, whichever way. But can you still afford your mortgage when, you lose that income? And a lot of people, losing social security, losing other benefits that, retirement benefits, things like that, that you don't fully, you're told and you're like, yeah, but you don't really fully understand the grasp of what that means to you today. And like how you mentioned, your mortgage, you could afford it today on your own income, but what about in 5 years or 10 years when your insurance rates go up and your tax rates go up and everything else, everything just continues to go up, and it's making sure that you have a plan to protect when something happens.
So, what are some good stepping stones? What are some good things to start thinking about or putting in place to get to that financial stability in the event that something happens?
Yeah, no. So there's obviously a couple steps. One, you've got your personal assets, your primary residence, your kids, college funds, things like that. And a lot of that is insurance, but a lot of that can also be, real estate investments. A lot of people will use trusts of different types. A lot of assets can be held within trusts. I will preface, I am not a lawyer. I am not a CPA. So I do recommend you talk to the correct estate planning attorneys or whatnot if you want to get more into this. There's the assets of protecting, the steps of protecting your assets so it does pass to the next generation. It passes to your spouse. It's, preserved so that if there are debts, outstanding when somebody passes, that the asset is protected, that the IRS can't come after them for things. So there's protecting your assets, but also making sure, that you are properly insured, and insured in a way that is really going to cover you. Because with you, Linda, having kind of the insurance background, I know you've seen firsthand how what insurance says on the front end versus what happens on the back end is not always the same thing.
Yep.
W-
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, how, in your experience in the insurance background, what is it? Some of the big fallacies you see with people getting, I want to say, scammed by their insurance, for lack of a better word.
I don't think that I can really go too far into that because I haven't been into the insurance world that long. And what I haven't dug too deep. So going
Mhm.
into the life insurance end, I'm still new to. On a personal end, I think that a lot of people will sell you quick policies. When you're looking at life insurance, they'll sell you a cheap policy because it's an easy sell and you don't ever know your full options. And the reality is, especially in my case, we had a cheap policy. Did it help? Of course it helped. But it wasn't knowing what I know now. Had we had some of the other options 10, 15 years ago when we actually bought that life insurance, we definitely would have went with some other options that would have accrued money over the years that we would have been able to cash out, or it would have grown with interest or whatnot. So I think when looking for things like that, you definitely want to work with someone who is going to educate you versus just try to sell you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because there's also,
Oh, I can't hear you.
there's like a whole there's also like a whole life policy that, is a different aspect than like term policy. And a lot of people will buy like a term policy because it's only good, for the term that you buy it. So if you live beyond the term, it's worthless. But the point is to cover you if something happens during that term. So if you're buying a new home or, investment properties, things like that, buying a term policy for, kind of that amount of that mortgage for that term of the mortgage is also a good way to protect yourself. And it's obviously a term policy is cheaper than like a whole life policy. But a lot of people also don't because, like, if I live longer, then it's a wasted money. I'm like, yeah, it is. However, if you don't, it's a huge, huge help for your family.
But a lot of people also don't realize that most terms you can convert
Hmm.
at the end of their policy. So it's not,
That's
sometimes terms are used for affordability at the moment and then later can
hmm
be converted to a different type of policy if that's the case.
that's a really good point because I've got a couple terms for some different assets. So I'm going to ask about that when it comes time, because it is something that's important to know. And how do you know this, right? How do you know how to ask these questions unless you've talked to somebody who's
That's the
doing
thing.
it the hard way?
You don't.
No.
So in my instance, I had to start learning, to get my license, I had to start learning about all these different options. And then I'm like, oh, well, shit, if I would have known that, then we would have done something different. But we didn't know that.
Hmm.
So that's why I'm big on, I want to educate people. At the end of the day, I don't care who you buy insurance from. But I want you to understand the options because there's so many more options than a lot of people present because they want a quick sell, they want quick money. If they can,
No. And
talk to 10 people in a day or a week or whatever the situation is and sell every one of those because it was a quick, easy close, they get their money and they keep
mhm.
rolling. They don't give a shit about your end game.
One, it's hard too because when you're in the middle, I hate shopping for insurance. I have, property insurance policies. I've got life insurance policies. Like nobody likes shopping for insurance. And I think sometimes the industry almost uses that to their advantage because people will settle for something less than ideal just to kind of get it done with and check the box. Like, yes, I got my insurance policy renewed. Yes, my properties are covered. Yes, I've got liability. Like whatever the case is, even car insurance and making sure, that you're going through. And then the language, there's so many different words used, terminology used. It's like you're almost speaking a different language. And again, how is we, the normal humans, supposed to be like, okay, say that again? Like, what do
Right.
you really mean here? And
Use
I
real
think it's
words,
important
break it
too.
down to real
Yeah.
people language.
Yeah, and making sure that whoever your insurance adjuster is, that you or your insurance seller is, like you feel comfortable with the words they're using and how they're explaining it to you so you aren't steamrolled into something that's not right for you.
And that you can always go back and reach out to that same person that sold you your insurance and ask questions. I think building the relationship with that person is just as important because, you know, you I I have many friends who have insurance, whether mostly through their jobs or whatnot. They have no idea what they have. They don't know what happens if their job closes tomorrow. What happens to that insurance? Do they just lose it? Like they don't know. It was a great idea. They offered it. We signed it, and we kept moving. So being able
Yeah,
to
no,
go back and have somebody that you build a relationship with, and you can not just, I guess, not just somebody that's gonna sell you insurance today and you never hear from them again. If something happens, you have to call a
right.
company and say, "Hey, I need to cash this shit in," instead of calling that person and saying, "Hey, this happened," or "What if," or, I don't know. I'm an educator and relationship builder. That's what I wanna do on this end.
No, but you're absolutely right because there is so much to that that you need to have almost lined out and almost have it available that if you are in that situation, somebody else can help make those calls for you. Because, there is a balance of like things that you are going to have to do if you lose your loved one, but also there's a lot of things other people can do. But if you don't have it organized or available or whatnot, nobody can help you until you have to, figure it
And
out and
nobody knows
organize it.
where to or who to call or
No,
what to do or any of that.
no. My husband's military. So I'm a fairly new military spouse. We've been married about 4 years. And one of the first things we did was fill out this paperwork of, if something should happen, what do you want to happen with your, who do you want to be by your side when you're told? Who are your parents? Like, how do we contact them? Like, all of these things. And so I was in a meeting and everybody laughs at me because I always ask these questions, but I was in a meeting and it was just me because no one else showed. But I had like all the command stuff. And I'm like, I want to know what will happen to me if something like really does. Like, I want to know how to understand my husband's paycheck. I want to understand where these resources are coming from. What offices do I need to contact? And they're like, no, the Air Force will take care of you. We have a whole division for that. And I politely was like, first
Still
of
wanna
all,
know.
I still want to know. And if, something happens to my husband, not only is it going to be him, it's going to be a whole crew of them. So it's not just him, there's going to be multiples of us. And secondly, like, the Air Force isn't worried about me at that point. The Air Force is worried about either what caused the accident, controlling the PR narrative behind it. Like, yes, they will send somebody to my door. And yes, there are resources. There are obviously hundreds of thousands of families that have lost spouses in the military. So there are resources, but I was like, I want this laid out for me. I want a checklist. I want it also. So if something happens and my mom comes down, I want her to be able to make some of these calls and help me through this process, in addition to me being in the middle of my grief. And I think that's a key part of any of this planning and protection is having that clear. How can somebody help you? Where is your policies? Who are your beneficiaries? That's always a good one.
And the first step is to start the planning.
Yeah, and just go through and update things because you don't know. I like my husband updated his life insurance policy, and then we got another statement, and it still had his parents as a beneficiary. So we had to resubmit all that paperwork again to get it updated. My grandparents, I saw he they'd been divorced for decades. And when my grandfather finally passed, a life policy came in with my grandmother, his ex-wife, as a beneficiary. He'd gone through like another spouse since then. He lived like an extra 2 decades. Like, I mean, it was probably like a 50-year gap
My
between
goodness.
when they got divorced and he passed. And the first wife was still the beneficiary. And she had been gone, for probably 10, 20 years at that point. So it was just all of these little loose ends that is so important to keep together, and it's not fun,
Well, I
but that's
think
the worst part.
yeah, and I think that if you planning the things is hard, right? It's hard to get there and say, "Okay, I'm actually
It's
gonna
hard to
plan
have
for
those
this." Because
conversations.
yeah, and even sitting in life insurance to plan that, I remember sitting there and I'm like, "I really have to answer these questions? Like, this is the most uncomfortable shit ever. Like, really?" So getting to the point to actually planning is a big step. So I think that once you're there, then you just kinda tuck all that shit away, and you don't wanna go back to it. So, for instance, your
Mhm.
grandpa, he's like, "That's just done there." Probably didn't even think about it, but you just don't wanna revisit that possibility of death, so you just tuck it away and leave it how it is, and you're like, dealt with it one time, and it is what it is.
Yeah, yeah, and I think too that I don't know if you had this experience, but I've seen it with my own grandparents, I've seen it with clients. When somebody passes, the IRS shows up for an audit. And especially if there's different levels of assets involved or things like that, that, like my grandma, when my grandfather passed, she got hit with this huge IRS audit. And thankfully, her daughters were able to help her through that. But not only, again, the spouse that she'd had for 50 some odd years, and now she has to deal with an IRS audit. And I think, when you've got the different assets and you've got real estate and depreciation schedules and all these different things going in it, it makes it obviously more complicated. But being aware of your rights and your power, because my grandmother, especially in the middle of all of her grief, was just ready to essentially kind of write a check. And thankfully, her daughters, my mom and her sisters were like, no, 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 like, we're going to fight this. This is wrong, and got their CPA involved and got, the right people involved to help her through this, because nobody should have to go through this stuff alone in the midst of grief. Like, that's just what's so hard
Yeah, and
about it.
then and then you fall into if there was debt or bills due or any of that. And I think it's very important to do your research because you don't always have to pay those. You're not always responsible for those. So, in the event that something does happen, don't feel like you are 100% have to do everything or pay everything because you may not. Definitely do your research because I did my research to see what I needed to pay and what I didn't need to pay. And if your name's not on it, then well, I don't know. Somebody else gonna figure it out. I'm not.
Yeah.
But then, like as a mortgage standpoint, like you said, there's insurance and stuff that you can buy to cover your mortgage or your house in that event. And you may know more than I know on this. My instance was I wasn't on the house. My mortgage was in my husband's name. It didn't make sense when we bought our house to have me on the mortgage. And of course, we were young. My husband was 40 when he died. We didn't think, anything like this was going to happen. So when he died, we didn't really have any mortgage protection to cover the house. It was all on me. And then I had to figure out how and if they were going to let me keep my house with me not being on the mortgage. Well, how does that work? And even through that process, I never spoke to one person. Everything was done via email. Like it was the craziest ride. I'm like, so I'm literally not speaking to anybody. We're emailing back and forth. And I have like it was so odd. And even my banker, he's like, they did what? Banker, lawyer, everybody was like, this is how this played out. I'm like, look, I'm gonna go with it because it was in my favor, but this was weird.
Did you end up having to get a new mortgage in your name, or did they end up assigning the mortgage to you, or?
So they end up granting me as the successor of the mortgage. So basically, at the end of the day, I can pay the mortgage if I want to stay here. If I don't want to stay here, I can roll out with no issues, no penalties or whatever. And if I want to sell the house, I can sell the house, pay off the mortgage, keep the rest.
Good. Good. Yeah, no, I mean, and that's the thing too, that banks don't want houses back. And I think people, they threaten foreclosure and they threaten this thing, but at the end of the day, the bank doesn't want your house in your town on your block back, because then that means
But they
they
want
have to
money.
deal with it. Yeah, they want the payments made every month. They want the money on the mortgage. And I think that's always something to keep in mind too, that even if you're, facing foreclosure or there's a short sale situation, banks really would prefer you to figure it out. And they will usually help you because they don't want the problem. Is really what it comes down to. And I think, them being able to give you as a successor on the mortgage is huge, because I'm assuming you're able to keep the terms and the interest rate and
Everything stayed
all
the
of
same.
that,
Yep,
which
nothing
is
changed.
fabulous.
They just said, okay, pay the bills and we're good, basically.
No, that's fabulous. That's great. And I think, that's important to remember too is, and then there's different things, like you can be on the mortgage or not, right? Because there's two people, like my husband and I, we went to go buy a house. I'm obviously a realtor. All my income's commission. It's very unpredictable income. I've got all these rental properties, so I've got all this debt. I'm like, I'm all over the place. And we went to go get a mortgage, and the banker was like, well, if we put you on the loan, we have to include all of your debt, but not your income. And we're like, well, that's
And
not
it doesn't make
helpful.
sense.
So I'll just be off the mortgage. but you can still be on the title of the property. So you could still be on the deed. And there's different types of deeds depending on the state, of like on death deed, it will automatically get deeded to somebody else upon that person's death. You can be co on title. So then that way, if one person passes, it just all averts to the next person. There's also a type of title where it will, like, there's two people and it will, half of it will go to the heirs. So, like, if one person dies, that 50% will go to the heirs, while then the other person will keep the other 50%. So it's a way to kind of also pass, assets along because I'm sure when you got into all this stuff, like, how do these assets go? Do they go to kids? Do they go to spouses? And making sure that one, you're within the limits for inheritance, and I think it's like 20 million. It's a really big number. Most of us don't have to worry about that number. What you can kind of pass down, but making sure like your bank accounts are all either, both names on it or you've got access to them. And then making sure, like with rental properties. And another thing that I see, say that again?
Beneficiaries on your bank accounts
Yes. Yes,
is
absolutely.
the smallest, easiest thing you could ever do is doing that. And if something happens, I know a lot of people think that, well, if my husband dies, there's no will, nothing like that. Everything goes to the spouse. That's not true. At least not in Indiana. The truth is, it is split between the paternal kids and the spouse. So I think that's a big misconception that people may have. Been there, done that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And it's a shame because there are so many families, and I mean, the story is essentially as old as time of families being torn apart by death and then fighting over assets or money or, things like that. I recently heard a story that there were two sons fighting over a shotgun that their dad had. It was like I don't even know, but they had a $10 million estate that they
Oh
could
my God.
not settle because the boys were fighting over a shotgun, which is just wild. But that's what
Death brings
happened.
out really bad in people.
Mhm.
Sometimes I've seen it over and over. And sometimes over people don't even have shit. Like, what are you fighting for? You're fighting for what? Little
It's memories.
things? Right. Like you're fighting for a piece of something, just
Yeah.
one tiny thing that came out the house or something. And that's not worth fighting with your family over. It's not gonna fix
No.
anything. So it just puts this wall up between people who are already in a bad spot, who are already grieving. And at the end of the day, keep your memories and keep rolling. Like you can't change it.
And I think it's important too to have the conversations, and have those conversations when you're alive with, I want you to have, if like I want you to have this painting, or I want, you, my son, to have your dad's rifle, or I want, have those conversations, even if it's not a formal conversation per se. Like growing up, my mom was always very open about, like, Amelia, you're going to get this ring, and then your brother's going to get this ring. And like, so we knew mom's intentions from the get go. Even now, they're starting to downsize, and I have my name on the back of paintings that I want, so my brother doesn't get them. And, there's different ways that you can have those conversations and make those plans. And obviously, nobody wants to live every day talking about death or, trying, but I think there is some easy conversations to have about intentions, about what you want, about where things are, and then even like assets. And there is no better time to pick up a cheap rental property than somebody's kid selling it when they inherited it from their parents. And
Right.
it's part of it because the kids don't want to deal with like a rental property, or they don't want to, manage it. They don't understand it. I, worked with a client, and she's like, my dad was huge in real estate and he never taught me anything. So now here she is, in her 50s, figuring it out and building her own nest egg that,
Yeah.
she could have inherited. And it's a shame that that education wasn't passed, those conversations weren't had, and how important it is to, like, if you're going to leave behind these assets, which one of the best things in real estate, they call, as the tax law currently stands, so that always changes, but it's called a step up in basis. So if you have rental properties or assets like that, whenever you pass, the next generation inherits it at like today's market value. So if grandma bought a house for, $20,000 way back in the day, and now it's worth 500,000, you don't have to pay tax on that gain. You inherit it at the value of 500,000. So then when you, as say the kid, if I inherit this house at 500,000, I can then turn around and sell it and not have to pay any taxes because I sold it for cost and I didn't have any gains in that process. So there's definitely some strategy too when you're dealing with assets to make sure that, like, hey, this is my intention. If you want to sell the property when I pass, that's fine, but we're going to hold it until that last moment. Or, because when you sell it during your lifetime, then you get into paying, capital gains tax, things like that, recoverable depreciation. There's all of these different things to it. And so it's just important to have those conversations,
Yeah,
as unfun
absolutely.
as they are, to have those conversations. Because even, reason my parents, I've grown up in real estate. My mom called and asked me these questions. I'm like, well, no, mom, at this point, keep the properties because I want that, I want that step up in basis. So if we're going to talk about it, and she's like, oh, okay, I didn't think about that, but it's hard because as a kid, you have one viewpoint. As a parent, you have one viewpoint. And, you're all coming at it from your own perspective, your own lens, your own life experiences. And so, if you don't have those conversations to make sure everybody's on the same page, you're gone, right? If you pass away, you're gone. It doesn't really matter to you what happens, but you don't ever want somebody to feel jilted or hated or picked on in death because they didn't get that gold ring left in their will, or they didn't get the rent house that they were born in, or whatever the case is. And those simple things can be prevented, and then you don't have lifelong grudges
Even if you write
by
it
just
down on a
having
piece of
simple
paper.
conversation.
Write it down
Yeah.
on a piece of paper if you don't do anything else. And I think all families are different. Some people, a lot of people, some people go into things and are like, oh, they died. I want. And then other people go in and we're like, these are things. We don't need the things. Obviously, in our situation, there wasn't like real estate or anything major like that. The things out of the house, like, so for instance, my mother-in-law and my husband died same day. We were cleaning out, I was helping my sister-in-law clean out my mother-in-law's house, and she'd be like, you want this, you want this? I'm like, they're things, like, if you want them, take them home. If you don't want them, we'll donate them. Like, we don't need all these things. And she didn't have to offer anything, that was her mom's house, that was her mom's stuff. But I am proud to say that her and I, in the mix of the fucking chaos that we went through for months, were really good at getting along and
That's
working
important.
together on all of the things. And a lot of families just aren't, they just don't do it that way. It's never made sense to me because I'm like, I'm not fighting with you over shit. Like, for what?
It is like a divorce too. Like, you could be married to somebody and then you start divorce proceedings and that switch
Changing
flips and
people.
they're a whole different
It's
person. And it's the same. It's a very similar experience. And even if you have the conversations, right? Even if mom says, I want you to have the gold ring, like, that's not going to prevent if you have a sibling that, oh no, that gold ring's mine, or, I wanted grandma's wedding ring, or, whatever it is. Like, it will never prevent everything. But the more you can talk about it and the more you can do the research into the business of death and what, like you said, your rights are. Like, there's some debts you don't have to pay. There's some that you better pay. All of those little pieces, and you don't want to figure it out in the middle of grief. Like,
no, it sucks.
that's the hardest time.
It does suck to deal with it in the mix of the things, but it's life. It's, if you can prevent
We
it,
get through it.
then do it. And if you don't do anything to prevent it, then you're going to be in the mix of it, and you'll get through it.
You will get through it.
Do
You are
your
absolutely
research,
correct.
ask for help. Is there anything you would like to leave us with today?
Not, it's just talk about have a tactical strategic conversation. And I hate using those kind of cold words, but especially when you're dealing with different assets, especially when you're dealing with mortgages, money, insurance policies. A lot of people will have a binder in like the corner of the room, or, I know my parents is on like the top shelf in their bookcase kind of thing. Like, this is the binder. This is where everything's kept. This is where, copies of the policies are. This is who our insurance agent is. This is, and even if you don't update it every year, at least it's something to start. It's
Yeah.
somewhere for your loved ones to start with if something were to happen to you. And I think that's, the most important part of that business of death, having a
And
strong foundation.
there are actual books made for that now.
Mhm.
I've seen them in the Hallmark stores. I've seen them in a couple of little boutiques. You can get them on Amazon, and they help you break that down. They help you say, "Hey, what's the insurance number? What's the bank account? Who's the beneficiary? What's your password?" They help with that stuff. So even if you don't know where to start, you want to start, you don't know where to start, that could be a good starting point.
Yeah. And there's so many resources online
Hmm.
too. And then there's, even online will making services and all of that. Just making sure too, every state is different. So make sure what you're doing works for your state and is going to be respected in your state.
Yeah.
And if you move, make sure that's updated for the new state as well.
All right, Amelia. Well, thank you for being here with us today and covering some much important topics that nobody likes to talk about.
Well, I appreciate you having me, Linda, and it's been a great conversation. And I am on Instagram, Facebook. It's just Amelia Meisenheimer. There might be one other Amelia Meisenheimer on Facebook, but I'm happy to help anybody or answer any questions that anybody has. So just feel free to reach out.
Perfect. And I'll link those in the description as well so everybody has them.
Thank you.
Thank you. We hope you enjoyed our conversation today. If you would like to join us on Facebook, you can find us at Grief Sucks Life After Loss. We look forward to seeing you again.